Hello, and welcome to the Culture Reset podcast, where we hear from great guests on how to create the best environment for success. I'm Caroline Kenyon.
And I'm Juliette Kumar. And together we're hosting another conversation about coaching, communications, and culture. And this time we're joined by a behavioural scientist and coach who teaches other coaches. Hello, Dr Rachael Skews. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I am, as you said, Dr Rachael Skews. So I have a background both in academic work through Goldsmiths University and consulting, business consulting. And most of what I do now is supervise coaches, provide coaching, and offer training specifically in acceptance and commitment coaching. So that's a little bit about me.
So your particular specialism, as you said, is acceptance and commitment coaching. And you're currently writing a handbook on the topic, aren't you?
Yes, I'm writing a book for Routledge and talking about what acceptance and commitment coaching is. It's a bit of I'm right at the beginning of the process. So I've got an idea of what the book is going to cover and where it might go. And I think if I speak to you in 6 months, when I'm hopefully near the end of writing it, I'll have a much better idea. But really, the idea behind the book is just to help people to see what it is, what does that type of coaching mean? What does it do? And talk a little bit about how to do it as well. So,
Well, good luck with that as you start on your journey.
I know, I feel like I need it. Thank you.
So tell us, before we start on understanding what that is more deeply, what got you to this point? What's your journey so far?
Well, as I said, I have a consultancy background. So I left university first time round. I say that because I retrained as a psychologist a little bit later in life. I was in my 30s when I was doing my master's and my undergraduate, my master's in psychology, and in my 40s when I was doing my PhD. So yes, I started off doing consultancy work and really liked. I mean, it was all consultancy that was in people management. Trauma, post-trauma support in the workplace, and outplacement, so support for people who've been made redundant. So and I was working on the business side of things, and I thought, this looks really interesting. I would like to, get more involved in that. And so I gradually worked my way over onto the delivery side of the business, and retrained as an occupational psychologist. And that was kind of when I started with Goldsmiths. I did my MSc in Oxide there and then did my PhD there. And my PhD was in coaching, using acceptance and commitment coaching in the civil service. So I was supporting senior leaders, and I did a randomized controlled trial looking at the impact of acceptance and commitment coaching on things like performance and well-being. It's a huge issue, as you know, in the workplace, and other things like self-efficacy. So that was a big study. We had about 130 people who took part in it. And what we were able to, through that data, kind of look at what was the impact of acceptance and commitment coaching. And one of the things that we see is an increase in what's called psychological flexibility. And we were able to, through the data, demonstrate that actually by increasing people's psychological flexibility, you're then getting this beneficial knock-on effect onto some of the other things that we're interested in coaching. Things like goal attainment and self-efficacy and mental well-being. So that was how I really got into doing this form of coaching. And after that, I then had a slight detour actually into health coaching, where I worked for Headspace, because they wanted to build a program for people who had chronic health conditions to support them, not to replace medication, but to help them make lifestyle changes that would ease their symptoms, improve their quality of life. So I spent about 3 years working at Headspace, doing work with that population and working on general mental well-being. And then I went independent. So now I do a lot of work supporting other coaches who want to learn how to do acceptance and commitment coaching. That's a large part of what I do now, as well as a few other things.
Gosh, doing a randomized control trial, that must have been rewarding and challenging. It's a gold standard, isn't it, in terms of research practice?
Yeah, definitely. And I think within the coaching field, it's one of the things that we could do with more of. There are problems with all the methodologies, but RCT data gives you some really useful insights that you can't get in other ways. You can sort of pinpoint, and it's the closest that we can get to saying something is causing something else. Something's really, you can attribute the coaching intervention to these changes. You can't really do that using any other methodology. I actually wrote a paper on the back of what I learned from doing that RCT. I wrote a paper called something along the lines of how to design and run quantitative studies in coaching. And I had recently at the Health and Wellbeing at Work conference, somebody came up and said to me, I used your paper to design a study. And I was like, yay!
And that's brilliant when your work goes on like that and other people use it. Fantastic.
Well done, well done. You mentioned Headspace, and that's a health tech company, isn't it? It provides a meditation and mindfulness app. So, how were you using your expertise in behavioral science there? You mentioned health coaching. Were you bringing in your scientific approach there then?
Yeah, definitely. So the role that I was part of the science team at Headspace, there was a number of us, predominantly psychologists, but from different disciplines. So I was pretty much the only person with an occupational psychology background, but really I was using my coaching knowledge and skills rather than some of the other things that I'm trained in terms of occupational psychology. But there was an experimental psychologist, there was a health psychologist, there were a couple of clinical psychologists. So it was a really cool, interesting place to work in terms of bringing together scientists who had these different backgrounds. Um, and as I said, the majority of us had that psychology training. I was the only British psychologist, so the rest of them were trained and had their qualifications in the US. But there's such overlap that didn't feel like that was a big kind of big difference in terms of our practice or the way that we worked. But what I really enjoyed was the nuances around what you do are slightly different when you come from these different domains. Bringing that together and having to challenge the way that I think, but also offer something different, and that was seen as a real strength in terms of the science. And I sort of started to associate. I mean, all of us, our job title was behavioral scientist. And that's really what we were there to do. I think we had that job title partly to help the non-scientific elements of the business understand what we do. If you just said, "Oh, I'm an occupational psychologist," everyone's like, What does that even mean?" I think coaching psychologists are a little bit more accessible, but it made it easier for everyone to have that same job title. I think that was part of it. And so you were working in interdisciplinary teams with people who are building the technology or the developers, people who were building in AI. So I was working with the machine learning team and designers, who, I mean, I don't know if you've had the opportunity to work with people who use like human-centered design, and there's such overlap with psychologists, the way that we think about stuff. So it was a really fun, really interesting, very eye-opening. Having gone from an academic department to a tech company, it was a bit of a shift change, but it was really creative and it was really enjoyable from that perspective. So yeah.
Well, great experience. It just sounds really good, doesn't it? And at the time, you did tell us before this podcast, Rachel, that you were training for a half Ironman, which is a tough physical challenge for anyone who doesn't know. And you had a bit of a light bulb moment while you were training, didn't you? Can you tell us more about that?
Oh God, yeah. So this was a really big aha moment for me, which I'm mildly ashamed of that because I started my career in consulting. So I was working with, as I said, one of the companies that I work with specialized in providing counseling and post-trauma services within the workplace. So it was an organization that was really tuned into some of those more challenging aspects of the workplace. Um, I'll come back to that in a moment. But I just suffice to say that was when I started learning about stress in the workplace. And I think I should have made this connection a lot earlier. But the story about when I was at Headspace, So it was in fact, the second lockdown, for the second COVID lockdown, which in the UK, which was at the end of 2020. And I was in London working remotely for Headspace. So I was starting work at 2 in the afternoon and finishing at 10 p.m. A slightly different work day to normal, what most people work in the UK. And I was working with a team, and we were looking at mental health across, the world, really, and talking about these different models of understanding mental health and different ways of understanding it. And then during this time, I was training for my first half Ironman. So I was sort of building up really my knowledge around physical training. So I've got this long, long background in stress in the workplace. It goes back maybe to like 2004, 2005, something like that, when I first started doing training in stress in the workplace. And then I started reading about, what it's like to do endurance training physically. And one of the things that struck me is when you're talking about human performance, you've got this same curvilinear relationship between strain and performance. So you need a certain amount of strain in order to get high performance. But if you tip over into too much, then you don't get a good outcome. And that was really interesting because we talk about that in physical training. So all of these books that I was reading about training for this half Ironman is recovery is so important. You've got to get the load right. They talk about training load. And that is, the hours that you're spending, the intensity that you're working at. So almost like there's really scientific mathematical models that you can use that will help you keep, monitoring your training load. And all of these books are really clearly saying if your training load is too high and your body's not adapted to it yet, you're going to get injured. I just had this absolute aha, like, why are we not talking about that for the workplace too? Or why are we not talking about that in terms of our mental well-being? Because I was doing a study with a really fantastic researcher called Ulrich Kirk, who is based in Copenhagen, I think, at the university there. And his work was all about heart rate variability. So I was doing this work with Ulrich, who was much, I mean, it's not an area I knew a lot about. I still don't know very much. I did learn a lot from working with him. And basically what heart rate variability is it's like a biometric measure of stress and strain, both physical and psychological. So that might have been my gateway, really, is that I also have a Garmin watch which measures my heart rate variability. So I was using this to manage my own training load for the half Ironman, working with this incredible researcher who I'm learning a lot about heart rate variability for mental health. So it's one of the things, Headspace was interested in it because meditation is a great way of getting this psychological recovery. It puts your body into a state of parasympathetic nervous system engagement, which is like our rest and recovery system. So that's why we were doing this work with Ulrich. And that was kind of the first time I'd really made this connection in my own mind, having, spent 10 plus years in consulting, looking at performance and, how do people really be at their best? How do you reduce stress in the workplace? How do you prevent people burning out? And all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, this is the same thing. It's absolutely, when we're talking about strain, we're talking about psychological strain, physical strain, and the conversation we're not having is about recovery.
Restoration and to get ready to carry on to sustain what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when we talk about, I've just been chatting to a friend of mine who I'm writing a paper with, and she works in academia. And I know academia is a very, very difficult place at the minute. But we're sort of planning, when are we going to work on this paper? And I said, oh, well, I'm on holiday at the beginning of June. She said, well, I'm going to have some time off in September. And I was like, are you not taking a break before then? And she said, no, I can't, because the work that she's having to do is such that There's no time. There's no time that she can take off. And I mean, she's an amazing researcher. She's an amazing academic. She's somebody who's really brilliant. But I was kind of chatting to her, saying, how are you managing that? People burn out if we don't have the rest and recovery. I won't, I won't go into loads of detail about that one case example, but I'm sure we've all seen it happen. You see colleagues who care so much about what they're doing being put under huge amounts of pressure, and you know that there is one outcome from that. And in the workplace, that's probably going to be burnout, or they're going to leave because it's just unsustainable. So a lot of the work that I do now is trying to help people to notice the things that are unsustainable and try and come up with ways of tackling that or adjusting what they're doing to something that is more workable. And I mean, that sounds really easy, doesn't it? Why on earth would you need a coach to do that? But it's more difficult than that. And often there can be the psychological barriers to say no to things. There could be environmental or contextual things going on that make it very difficult for people. And as you've told me before, a lot of people that listen to this are NHS, and that I can imagine will be something that people are very familiar with for themselves and for others.
So you talk a lot about psychological flexibility. What is that, and what does it look like in practice?
So psychological flexibility, it's a kind of construct that comes from acceptance and commitment theory. So if people have come across ACT, or what I talk about, acceptance and commitment coaching, which is just ACT within the coaching context, psychological flexibility is like the thing that we are trying to activate pretty much all of the time. The reason being, it's this idea of helping you to more consciously adapt to your environment. um, so by that, what I mean is like being a little bit more present and aware, noticing what's going on. And again, doesn't that sound simple? But we really struggle with that quite a lot of the time, myself included. We're often like time traveling into the future or the past, thinking about what is it that I need to do, but not really being right here in the moment. Um, so that's one aspect of it. The other side is that once you've got that kind of connection with what's going on, being in the present moment, really thinking about what is going to work for me here longer term rather than just short term. And the reason I say that is quite often as humans, we're so brilliantly adapted to avoiding anything that's uncomfortable or painful or, some things that we don't like, we tend to turn away from, and like a wonderful adaptive process that we have. But a lot of the time, I'm working in spaces where maybe avoiding having a difficult conversation is not serving you so well. Or maybe there's something that you need to do that you don't feel that comfortable to do, just purely by the fact that if you did feel comfortable, you probably already have done it. So, psychological flexibility is not just the being in the present moment, but it's also about being able to notice and recognize things that might feel hard to do, but are actually going to serve you quite well. So, it's also about identifying what we refer to as values. So, and I know loads of people who've worked in organizations have a bit of an aversion to the word values because we've kind of been served them over the years and they can sometimes feel very inauthentic. But I'm using that as a label for just anything that brings that sense of meaning, purpose, and vitality to you in your life, like for you as a human being. You know, what is it about what you do that drives you, that connects for you, that matters? What feels important? So it's about helping people to, again, notice what's the direction of travel that takes you towards those things. What are you avoiding that maybe isn't serving you so well? And what do you need to do in order to connect with those things that really matter to you? And then can you do that? That might feel really hard. It sounds really simple, doesn't it? But it can be profoundly difficult in real life. So that's why the coaching
And
it's helpful.
what's the relationship with the acceptance and commitment part of the psychological flexibility? Can you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. So the commitment part is the values. So it's the commitment is moving towards the things that bring you that sense of meaning and purpose. They can be things that make you happy, But often we kind of downplaying the connection with happiness because we know that there can often be a challenge in there. Like nobody's ever happy about having a difficult conversation. Yet having that difficult conversation could really help you get to where you want to be longer term. So that's why they use the term commitment. Similarly, with acceptance, it's about this idea of there are things that you are possibly going to have to do that you don't necessarily want to do. So it's a sense of an acceptance of challenge, an acceptance of doing things that might feel difficult if they are in the service of things that matter to you longer term. So the acceptance and commitment are trying to evoke this sense of if you want to live more connected to the things that matter to you, you know, firstly, connecting with what they are through the commitment of the action that you take on, and then acceptance of some of the challenges along the way.
Could you give us an example of how that might work in a workplace setting, of somebody in a workplace setting, you're coaching them? What might that look like in practice?
Oh, I can give you loads of examples. So let me think of some of the really common ones. Oh, like I say, there's plenty. I do a lot of work with leaders. And so one of the things that I'm often talking to people about is what is the kind of leader that you want to be? What is it to you about the work that you do, the team that you're part of, the work that you're contributing to in the organization? What about that matters to you? And so we can build up a picture when you've got leaders who are not really being as effective as they could be. And I'm not really talking about task performance here. I think that can be part of it, but we're sort of making the assumption that people are competent in their jobs. Now, I'm saying that only because I think sometimes people can conflate these things and use coaching in situations where I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, which is if people are not competent in their job. Like that's a different that's a performance conversation. And if you're working with leaders who are underperforming in their leadership capacity, and quite often what I find is that there are dynamics at play that are stopping them from being the leader that they want to be. And once you help them to connect with that, actually they can have better relationships with their team. They can manage upwards more effectively. Through developing that intrapersonal understanding, you actually help them to improve their relationships with others, their interpersonal kind of abilities and skills. So we talk about all of these things as being skills that people can develop. It doesn't matter how high or low your psychological flexibility is, you can develop it, you can increase it. And I think that's quite an important part of this is, it's something that we can get better at. And some people are naturally really psychologically flexible. I also work with people who might already have like a journaling practice, or they might do meditation and things. And so they're already through those activities, they've got some of these skills really well developed. And then we might think about where are maybe the acceptance work that they've got to do, that kind of thing. Other examples, a really common one, I don't know if you've come across this in your work, imposterism, this idea of being a fraud. Somebody's going to find out I don't know what I'm talking about. It shocked me when I first started doing leadership coaching at scale, really, I suppose. And it shocked me how many people would talk about that. And they would walk into the coaching room. At this point, I was doing face-to-face coaching. Most of my work now is online, but, it was stepping into a room with somebody. And they would look, like amazing. They would have a great job and, really lovely people. And then, as the coaching progressed and they would start to open up about their thoughts and their feelings, I was absolutely gobsmacked how many people had this feeling of someone's going to realize I don't know what I'm doing. And the anxiety that was being evoked from that, I mean, I've had it. I have to say, one of my little tips, a PhD does help with that. I don't feel so much imposterism these days because I've got this sort of deep, deep, deep expertise in this very one little area. But it was also through the work that I did around acceptance and commitment theory there's enormous like an explanation for why people feel like that, which I found really interesting, which is, you know, often it's things that people care deeply about, work that people care deeply about, and this sort of relationship they have to themselves, this self-criticism that we all have, which we don't give that to other people in the same way. So when they walk into the room, I'm I'm not giving them the same criticism that I might give myself internally, this internal like dialogue that we have with ourselves. Um, but we're often carrying that around, that sense of I'm not good enough. Somebody else is going to have the answer. I don't know. Um, so firstly, I think it's really empowering to share that this is really common. I There's very few people, if any, that I've met who have never had that experience of feeling like an imposter. Um, so I think it's good for us to recognize that, this is often just the way that we feel. And that sometimes through having an honest conversation with ourselves, noticing that we're being so self-critical, thinking about where does that come from? And often it's coming from a place of caring very, very deeply about something, so that's kind of almost triggering these thoughts of imposterism because you care. And then just helping people to notice that that's all going on. And whereas a traditional CBT coaching approach would maybe do the thought disputation, you try and get rid of some of those thoughts. The difference is in acceptance and commitment coaching, actually trying to change your relationship with them and understand them as a part of you. Like they come from somewhere, they come from actually a place of you caring about this, doing a good job. So that's where the acceptance comes in. It's like you can switch off the imposterism, but it kind of means you have to switch off caring too. And do you want to do that? Maybe not. So maybe you can recognize that this is a lived experience that loads of us have. Like there's nothing wrong with you. It's just uncomfortable. It's just really unpleasant. And so let's try and make friends. It sounds odd, doesn't it? Let's try and make friends with this idea that you're not good enough. See where it comes from. Notice that it's a part of you. It's driving you. It's trying to make you be the best version of you that you can be. It's just not doing a great job of that. And so kind of being able to harness the caring whilst improving the relationship between you and that thought or that feeling. And really that's about the relationship we have with ourselves, which is where things like self-compassion can be really helpful too. So I do a lot of work with leaders around developing a greater sense of compassion for themselves, which then also has a nice knock-on effect usually in terms of their relationships with other people too. Sorry, that was a huge Andy there.
It wasn't you, Dance, it was a huge subject. But these, of course, would be self-critical because they know they're expected to have all the answers and nobody has all the answers. So,
Exactly.
yeah, I completely get that. And I've found that in conversations with leaders as well. Um, how would you summarize in a very simple way what acceptance and commitment is in a workplace setting? When you're coaching other coaches, how do you define it for them so that they can really hone in on it?
Mm. So I think you can define it in lots of different ways. And one of the great things is it's very adaptable. So when I'm talking to leaders about the work that we're doing, I'll be talking about their relationship with themselves, their relationship with others, and the decisions that they're making. And that is psychological flexibility. I'm just pulling things out and calling it different things. So I won't use any of the technical language here, but psychological flexibility, it's like being in the present moment, but also how are you thinking about yourself? Those are two of the 6 overall processes that are combined together to be psychological flexibility. So I might be talking about that kind of thing with my coaches when we're sort of contracting and when we're thinking about things. But I might use phrases like, situational awareness. Or I might talk about decision making. I talk a lot about decision making because, ultimately, that's what this is about. It's like deciding what's important, finding ways of connecting with that. What are the actions, the workable actions that are going to get you to that goal or that destination? So that's one way that I might talk about it. I talk about it differently if I'm working with different audiences. And some of this came from when I was working with Headspace, where we were building these kinds of things, but it had to be for a general population, so anybody, and the reading age was about 8. So jumping from an academic place where everyone is very wordy and, very precise, but almost impenetrable, to Headspace, where it was like, you have to make this accessible and inclusive to everybody. And we would use language like doing what matters, keeping it super, super simple. So what matters? What do you need to do? What can you do? What's something that you can do to connect with that? In the workplace, of course, people's reading age is generally higher, but the principle is still there, that these ideas and concepts, it's really helpful to have a few different ways to explain them, depending on the context, depending on who you're working with. If I'm working with leaders, I might emphasize certain things. If I'm working with people for their own stress management, I might be talking about things slightly differently and just give it a different flavor. I hope that answers your question.
You've got so much knowledge to share, and I could listen to you for ages. And for any coaches out there, we'll put some links to your website and resources in the podcast notes. But we do need to bring the conversation to a close. We always ask this of all our guests. Could you give us one top tip, either for coaches or non-coaches, on resetting workplace culture?
So for me, one of the big top tips, and I'm going to anchor this, there are so many, because I think you guys have such an interesting space that you're discussing here. So I promise I will keep this short. I would think about the avoidance, where the avoidance is causing problems in terms of workplace culture. And one of the keys, I think, to addressing that is things like psychological safety, creating safe spaces where people can feel vulnerable, and who, those spaces in which people can explore things that are not working well for them and where they might be needing to make adjustments that feel very difficult for them too. So whether or not you're doing that at the organizational level and creating a culture of psychological safety across the organization, within teams, but I also think relationships and the kind of spaces that leaders create, I think that is one of the biggest places in which we can improve that. Giving employees the opportunity to be more psychologically flexible, because we know then that you get these lovely knock-on effects onto some of the outcomes that matter in terms of organizations.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachael Skews. I'll certainly be looking out for that handbook.
Me too. I think it'd be helpful in many situations at home as well as at work. Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow Culture Reset and check out our previous episodes with brilliant guests like Rachel. But for now, it's goodbye from me, Caroline Kenyon.
And from me, Juliette Kumar. Goodbye.